Edward Whitmore slid the $2 million check across the table like he was feeding a stray dog. The chandelier light caught the ink. The Manhattan skyline burned behind the glass, and for one long second, the entire dining room felt smaller than the insult sitting in the middle of it. "Take it," Edward said, leaning back with that polished, expensive smile. "Disappear, son-in-law. My daughter deserves better than an average man who got lucky." No one at the table gasped. No one asked him to stop. No one even pretended the words had gone too far. And somehow, that was what made it crueler. Because disrespect from a powerful man is ugly. But disrespect in a room full of people who know your name, know your history, and still choose comfort over courage, that lands deeper. Clara Whitmore didn't defend him. She didn't even look at Julian right away. She simply swirled the wine in her glass and said, softly, almost gently, "He's had a good run, Dad. 2 million is generous." That sentence cut deeper than Edward's. A father-in-law can dislike you. A proud man can look down on you. The world is full of that kind of arrogance. But when the person who once held your hand begins speaking about your life like a clean little business arrangement, something much quieter breaks. Julian Cross sat at the far end of the table, hands loosely folded, face unreadable, posture calm enough to be mistaken for detachment. No anger, no argument, no wounded pride searching for an audience. Just a small, cold smile that never touched his eyes. Edward noticed it first. Clara felt it second. Because neither of them understood yet that the average man they were trying to erase had already owned the floor beneath their feet for 6 years, and in less than 48 hours, the company carrying the Whitmore name would no longer belong to the family sitting around that table. But before I tell you how a billionaire father tried to buy off the son-in-law he thought was harmless, only to discover that the quiet man at his table held the controlling stake all along, welcome to Empire Downfall. If you love stories where hidden power changes everything, where arrogance finally meets consequence, and where the quiet ones reveal themselves too late for anyone else to stop it, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay with me until the end. Because this one isn't only about power. It's also about what happens when love slowly forgets how to protect someone's dignity. 3 weeks earlier, Julian Cross still looked exactly like the man the Whitmores loved to underestimate. 37, calm, unshowy, dark suits without logos, a voice that never needed to rise, the kind of man who listened all the way through before speaking, which, in arrogant families, is often enough to get you mislabeled as weak. Edward Whitmore liked to call him solid. What he meant was ordinary. Edward was the founder and public face of Whitmore Biotech, one of those men who had spent so many years being called visionary that he eventually began to believe the word described not just his work, but his nature. Silver hair, navy suits, the kind of smile that had convinced investors, journalists, and half of Manhattan that confidence was the same thing as wisdom. He loved being admired. More than that, he loved the subtle choreography of power, the way voices changed in a room when he entered it, the way people laughed a little too quickly at his jokes, the way respect could be extracted simply by making others feel smaller. And next to a man like that, Julian became easy to misunderstand. Julian did not perform intelligence. He did not compete for dominance. He did not need a room arranged around him in order to know who he was. That kind of quiet is invisible to people who only recognize power when it arrives loudly. When Julian first met Clara, she felt different from the family she came from. Warmer, lighter, as if somewhere beneath all that old money polish and inherited certainty, there was still a woman who had not fully surrendered to her family's emotional climate. She laughed with her whole face then. She asked questions that sounded sincere. She seemed relieved by Julian's steadiness, even drawn to it, like someone exhausted by performance finally encountering peace. Julian fell in love with that version of her. Maybe that version had been real. Maybe it existed for a while. Maybe that was what made the rest of it so hard to understand. Because most relationships do not shatter all at once. They thin out. A little warmth disappears here. A little respect goes missing there. Someone laughs at the wrong joke and says they didn't mean anything by it. Someone stays silent 1 second too long. Someone chooses ease over honesty, family over fairness, appearances over tenderness. And then one day, two people who once chose each other find themselves sitting at the same table, speaking in voices so careful and distant they could belong to strangers. At the Whitmore penthouse, Julian was never truly treated like family. He was tolerated, evaluated, positioned. Edward liked asking Julian business questions in front of other people just so he could interrupt the answer. He would let Julian get halfway through an intelligent, measured point before cutting in with a louder, shallower version of the same thing, as if volume itself were a credential. Vivian Whitmore, Clara's mother, preferred cruelty with better posture. "Julian has such a calming effect on Clara," she would say over a glass of red wine, smiling as though she were complimenting a lamp. Not every man is meant to lead. Some are simply meant to stabilize. The table would laugh. At first, Clara would squeeze Julian's hand under the table, a quiet apology, a private acknowledgement, a little signal that she still saw the insult for what it was. Then, over time, she stopped. That was one of the first real fractures, not because the insult got bigger, but because the protection got smaller. Soon, the pattern hardened. Edward mocked Julian's clothes in front of investors, joking that he dressed like a private banker who misplaced his ambition. At corporate dinners, he introduced him as Clara's husband, instead of using his name. At one gathering, when Julian quietly raised a serious regulatory concern buried inside one of Edward's flashy expansion plans, Edward smiled into his bourbon and said, "This is why average men should never be given advanced information. They mistake concern for insight." The room laughed. And Clara laughed too. Just for a second. Just enough. Julian never argued, never sulked, never demanded an apology from people who had already decided how much respect he was allowed to keep. He simply noticed. That was what nobody in the Whitmore family understood about him. Julian did not process disrespect like a performer. He processed it like an architect. He stored details, patterns, alignments, silences. He noticed who benefited from the humiliation, who stayed quiet, who started sounding more like Edward every season, who reached for his steadiness only when it was useful, then stepped away from it the moment power entered the room. And the most painful part wasn't Edward. Edward had always been Edward. The deeper wound was Clara. Because there are really two heartbreaks in a story like this. The first is being diminished. The second is realizing the person who once loved you has become comfortable watching it happen. Julian knew something none of them fully grasped. He had been far more important to Whitmore Biotech than Edward would ever willingly admit. 6 years earlier, during a brutal patent crisis and systems failure that nearly collapsed the company, Edward had been desperate. Quietly desperate, but desperate all the same. Public panic would have been catastrophic. Internal leaks were already circling. The company needed emergency stabilization, structural governance repair, and a layer of technical containment so airtight it could be deployed without ever revealing how close Edward had come to losing everything. Julian stepped in privately, not as an employee, not as a public executive, not as a son-in-law trying to impress anyone. He stepped in because Clara had asked, because she had looked at him back then with fear, trust, and something that still resembled love. Because she had said, "Please help him. Please help us." So Julian did. He rebuilt the internal architecture. He redesigned critical systems. He wrote the governance triggers. He constructed the silent recovery package that allowed Whitmore Biotech to keep breathing without broadcasting its weakness to the market. And buried inside that rescue structure, nested behind emergency voting protections, founder recovery language, deferred contingencies, and executive conduct triggers Edward barely read because men like Edward only read what flatters them, sat the clause that would one day matter more than every speech Edward had ever given. 51% conditional controlling interest, dormant, silent, invisible, activated only under fraud, coercive conduct, or executive impairment. Julian never intended to use it. That mattered to him. He had not married Clara to position himself for war. He had loved her. And healthy love does not begin by drafting escape routes from the person you trust. That was never Julian. But love without respect becomes something else over time, something thinner, something lonelier, something that still uses the language of partnership while quietly withdrawing the instinct to protect one another. The moment everything changed did not begin with Edward. It began with Clara. One rainy Thursday evening, Julian came home early and heard her voice coming from the den. She was on speakerphone with Edward, and there was something in her tone he had never heard before. Not anger, not grief, not even frustration. Fatigue. The kind of fatigue that comes when someone has already emotionally left a relationship and is now trying to translate that exit into practical terms. "Dad's right," she said. "I've outgrown him. 2 million and a quiet exit. He'll take it. He always lands softly." Edward laughed. "Harmless husbands are expensive to build," he said, "but cheap to remove." Clara didn't laugh immediately, but she didn't push back either. And somehow that silence said more than either sentence around it. Julian stood in the doorway, unseen. He recorded everything. Not because he wanted vengeance in that moment, but because there comes a point when refusing to document the truth becomes its own form of self-betrayal. That night, he sat alone in his office with the city glowing cold behind the glass and listened to the recording more times than he wanted to admit. Not just to the plan, not just to the money, not just to the exit strategy wrapped in calm voices, but to the absence of love in Clara's tone. That was the part that finally reached him. Because if she had been angry, he could have understood anger. If she had fought with him, demanded more from him, accused him of failing her, at least the relationship would still have been alive enough to wound honestly. But this was different. This was someone helping place a price tag on her husband's worth.
And once that happens, something sacred has already begun to leave the room.
Julian didn't confront her, didn't demand some last-minute performance of remorse, didn't beg to be chosen by someone who had already started choosing convenience instead. He went to work. He pulled deleted emails, mirrored board communications, recovered draft documents, activated dormant clauses, prepared the veto package, mapped the founder agreement chain, verified the control language, reopened the silent governance pathways, prepared a press release under seal, reconstructed the procedural staircase Edward had once raced down without ever noticing who built it. And beneath all that discipline, beneath the screens and filings and authorization chains, there was something quieter. Grief. Not dramatic grief, not the kind that shouts. The private kind. The kind that arrives when you realize the person you loved did not need to save you from the whole world. Only from the small humiliations that should never have been allowed to grow. The next family dinner was meant to be the final transaction. The room had the atmosphere of polished violence pretending to be civility. Crystal, imported stone, a skyline view sharp enough to feel staged. Two senior executives from Whitmore Biotech sat halfway down the table, pretending neutrality while watching everything with the bright-eyed caution of people who already believed they knew who would win. Edward pushed the check across the table again. $2 million. "Take it," he said. "Disappear, son-in-law. My daughter deserves better than an average man who got lucky." Clara added her own blade, gentler and somehow worse. "You always land softly, Julian. That's kind of your thing." The executives laughed. Then one of them, eager and stupid in the way sycophants often are, said it aloud. "Useful idiot." The room erupted. Julian smiled. Then he picked up the check, folded it neatly in half, and placed it beside his plate. "You're right about one thing," he said softly. "I do land softly." Then he looked at Clara, not angrily, not hopefully, just clearly. "But I never needed your floor to stand on." That line landed because it wasn't revenge. It was recognition. He stood, thanked Vivian for dinner, nodded once toward the executives, and walked out without another word. Over the next 36 hours, silence became structure. Julian activated every backdoor he had written years earlier, finalized every dormant pathway, triggered the governance conditions, queued the board packet, secured the veto chain, prepared the reassignment language, made sure every procedural door Edward believed belonged to him would open only once, and not in his direction. By morning, the trap was complete. The board meeting looked ordinary to everyone who didn't know power was about to move. Glass walls, river view, polished table, packets neatly arranged. Edward, in full performance mode, speaking about expansion, innovation, legacy, and the future of medicine, like a man who still believed the company was a mirror built to reflect him. Clara sat quietly at the side as an observer. She looked composed, but Julian noticed what others wouldn't: the slight stiffness in her shoulders, the way her jaw kept tightening and releasing, the tiny pause before she reached for her water. Maybe for the first time she understood something was wrong. Maybe part of her hoped there was still time, but some doors close long before anyone hears them lock. Edward finished his presentation and smiled at the board. "If there are no objections," he said, "I think we can move to approval." Julian opened the folder in front of him. No flourish, no speech, no drama. Just 4 words. "I object." Edward frowned. "On what grounds?" Julian slid the original rescue agreement across the table, then the ownership schedule, then the triggered clause. 51%, he said calmly. "Holder, Julian Cross, effective yesterday." The room froze. Edward laughed first, the brittle, dying laugh of a man whose ego is trying to buy time for his brain. "That's impossible." Julian looked at him with terrifying stillness. Power doesn't ask permission from the man who misplaced it. Then he tapped the pages one by one. "This project is vetoed." Another page. "Your executive authority is terminated." Another. "You've been moved to advisory status. No voting rights, no unilateral decisions." Edward shot to his feet. "You can't do this!" Julian didn't blink. "Sit down, Edward. You're embarrassing yourself in a room you no longer control." The silence that followed felt almost physical. Clara stared at Julian like she was seeing him for the first time. And maybe she was. Maybe what she had loved was the version of him that made her feel safe. Maybe she had confused gentleness with limitation. Maybe she had been around hierarchy so long that she stopped recognizing the quiet strength of someone who never needed to turn love into dominance. Julian turned to her then. His voice was not cruel. That made it worse. True love doesn't stand by silently while someone negotiates your husband's worth, he said, and it doesn't help hold the pen. Clara looked like she wanted to say something, a defense, an apology, his name. But some truths arrive too late to save anything. Julian stood, buttoned his jacket, and delivered the line that would stay with everyone in that room, long after the board had rewritten the future of the company. Power doesn't roar, he said. It waits in silence, until the arrogant hand it the microphone. Then he walked out. By sunset, Edward Whitmore was a ceremonial figure in the company he once ruled like a monarchy. The expansion project was dead. The board had already begun to realign. The loyal executives were suddenly less loyal. Clara's calls went unanswered. And Julian left the building without a victory lap, without a statement, without even pausing long enough to enjoy the expression on anyone's face. Because the deepest kind of power never needs applause. And maybe that's the real reason stories like this stay with people. Not because a proud man lost control, not because a hidden clause changed everything, not even because the quiet one finally revealed his strength, but because somewhere inside all of it was a more human ache. The ache of watching love thin out in real time. The ache of realizing that relationships do not always end with dramatic betrayals. Sometimes they fade through small permissions. One unchallenged insult, one nervous laugh, one practical compromise, one silence too many. Some endings do not explode. They cool. And by the time anyone names what has changed, the warmth is already gone. Julian walked away with the company. Edward lost the microphone. But Clara was left with something harder to measure. Not scandal, not punishment, not the public embarrassment of a fallen family. Just memory. The sound of a check sliding across a table. The sight of a husband sitting still while his worth was discussed like a solvable inconvenience. The unbearable possibility that the real ending had begun much earlier, in moments small enough to excuse, but too important to survive. Perhaps that is what makes certain stories linger. Not the scale of the reversal, but the recognition they awaken. How many relationships are changed by what never gets interrupted? How much closeness is lost, not through dramatic cruelty, but through repeated hesitation? How often does someone begin to feel negotiable in the eyes of the person they trusted most long before either of them says the word goodbye? Power can be rebuilt. Reputation can be rewritten. Even companies can survive being taken from the people who thought they owned them. But once someone begins to feel alone inside a love that used to shelter them, something invisible shifts. And even if life continues beautifully on the outside, people rarely forget the first moment they understood that affection and respect were no longer arriving together. Maybe that is the quietest truth in all of this. Not that Julian was stronger than they knew, but that strength is often born in the exact place where tenderness stopped being safe. If you stayed until the end, maybe that's the thought this story leaves behind. What keeps two people close when power, family, pride, and fear all enter the room with them? And at what point does silence stop feeling like peace and start becoming the first language of distance? If this story stayed with you, leave a like, subscribe to Empire Downfall, and tell me in the comments, which hurts more in the end? Open disrespect from someone who never loved you, or the quiet moment when someone who once did stopped standing between you and it? This is Empire Downfall. I'll see you in the next one.